in 1845, Robert Pell in Esopus planted 10,000 Newtown Pippins and established this premium trade, and they were getting $21 a barrel in 1845, and those apples were retailing for 42 cents a pound in London.
Hello, my name is Ria Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this here episode 358 was Elizabeth Ryan. She was on a panel discussion from CiderCon 2023, and the topic was the history, pomage, and terroir of New York State's cider. And specific to this conversation were three different apples. Here she was talking about the Newtown Pippin, and wasn't that an amazing factoid about how it was being shipped to England? And then two other apples. So it was a Newtown Pippin, the Northern Spy, and the Esopus Spitzenberg. So we're going to be getting into that featured presentation coming up. It was both Elizabeth Ryan, Dr. Gregory Peck, who is from Cornell University, and also Dr. Ian Merwin, who has a cidery now, but as you will hear him mention in this featured presentation, he had Gregory Peck as his student at Cornell University. So this is just a really powerhouse panel, and I had the privilege of moderating it. But there wasn't a lot of moderating to do when you have this type of caliber of knowledge. It's just a total think tank. And with my dear friend Elizabeth at the front line, she's just an encyclopedia, a walking encyclopedia of apples and also specific to New York State. You just got to let it loose. So you have that treat coming up very soon. But first, we have a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. I have an email from Dave, who is a new patron of Cider Chat. He joined via the Cider Chat Patreon page, and there's something I always do with patrons, which is I ask them a couple questions, and this is what he wrote. He began with, "Hi, Ria. Thank you for continuing to produce new Cider Chat episodes. I found Cider Chat on my own a few years ago while searching for information and material on cider and cider making. In the past few years, I've gone from a cider admirer to cider enthusiast to home cider maker and finally to aspiring craft artisan cider maker. Wow." Hey, I have seen this path many times, Dave. Rock on. He continues with, "My view of cider is much like my view on wine. Everything has its place. There are enough styles, types of cider out there to suit almost any situation. My current go-to ciders are dry American ciders made with a blend of new and old world apples. Living in Houston, Texas, it can be hard to find cider. This is beer country, so I take what I can get. Shout out to Eden Specialty Ciders for bringing some of their canned ciders to Texas." Yeah, that's a Vermont cidery, Eden Specialty Ciders. If you don't know Eden, look it up. Look it up. I've had Eleanor Leger on the podcast a couple times here. Most recently, she was at the Celebrating Women in Cider very special dinner that we had over the weekend for Cider Days 2.0. Just a lovely person and great ciders. You are lucky down there in Texas. He ends with, "You keep doing what you're doing. The variety of topics you cover from apples to cideries to marketing media is one of Cider Chat's strengths. Keep up the great work." Well, thank you very much, Dave. And what is going on in Texas? There's like a flurry of folks that I'm connecting with. You know, we heard from Rachel last week, who's starting the Kanga cider, and now here you are, Dave, rocking it in Houston, Texas. Who doesn't love the apple, right? It's something that everyone in the world can get behind, and yeah, wow, Texas. I need a little pause here. This is just like dropping me to the floor. I love it. I absolutely love it. Thank you so much, Dave, and keep us posted. Speaking of CiderCon, there's a lot to be said about it, isn't it? And I'm going to be rolling out a whole bunch of episodes now in this series, all from CiderCon interviews and different seminars. One of the things that was interesting for me, and this is just something if you are in the industry to, I don't know, put a pin in it, maybe. I'm not sure. It's your way to do business. But I know I've had a couple different life path careers. And when I jump in, I kind of go full in. And certainly cider has been part of an affection for me for many years. And then I was doing other work and other consulting, and now I'm pretty full in on cider. And as such, I try to stay connected as possible. So here's a couple tips from someone like myself who's in media for all the commercial makers out there. Follow media. Follow them. Watch what I'm doing. Watch what some of the other folks who are putting out blog posts. There's not that many of us, so it's not too difficult to follow. And keep your world wider than your own front door, because that's going to help you connect with media, know what's going on, and stay in tune. So, for instance, I was on the cider tour, the historic cider tour, and I was hanging out with somebody. His name is Ted. He's from Missouri, a startup cidery, and really, really nice guy. And I remember I was up in the sound booth on the day that CiderCon started. So that was the official kind of introductory day in the morning. And they have a keynote speaker, and that was on Thursday, February 2nd. And music from this podcast, 2 songs that I wrote and played with my cousin Jay, you just heard a little transition piece, was playing on the loudspeaker. And I saw Ted, who I'd just been hanging out with 2 days before, come running up to the sound booth, asking people, where's this music? And it was like the We Like Cider song and Strange Apples. One of those will play at the end of this here episode. And I realized at that moment that despite the fact that he met me, and this is probably my fault, he didn't really understand what a cider podcast was and what it could offer for somebody who is an amateur cider maker like myself, or wanting to start up a cidery, or is in that process, or wants to keep on building up their techniques. This is a real gray area for the industry when folks aren't supporting media in a way by just sharing that. Not, yes, it'd be wonderful if you could financially support Cider Chat. That'd be groovy cool. It would make my life a whole lot easier. But the other piece is just the verbal sharing to educate both oneself and consumers, because people are hungry for this. They want to stay connected. And you might be feeling connected to Cider Chat, but if you're not spreading the word, then it's going to be a really small world, and we're going to stay this really niche trade, which maybe that's okay. Maybe that's working for you. And here's one more little piece, too, since I'm on a roll. CiderCon, the association, the American Cider Association, offers a mobile app each year during this amazing conference. And this year's app, which is an app called Event Mobile, hardly anybody was using it. There was some use for that game where you're finding the Apple baseball cards, and that was a great way to keep people engaged. Folks were into well done ACA. But for the most part, from my perspective, I was seeing folks put up their photo, but no bio, no contact. I don't really know who you are, and I'm sorry for that. There's so many people, so many faces, and I lose it when I'm just streaming with 1,000 people in person. I just can't remember it. And more so, that app becomes really helpful for me post the conference to look up, to do the follow-up. And the harder that becomes to be able to hunt you down, then I won't. It's just I can't. And that's true for me. If that's true for me, then think about the other media that kind of lost opportunity. So this is my little kick in the pants for all the folks out in the commercial trade to do this little small step. Took 10 minutes, if that, to get your own little bio up, to put in your email, and at least put your name, where you work, maybe your job title, and what locale that is, what state or what country that is really, really helpful and a nice way to stay connected. So those are my 5 cents for you. And when I return, we have a word about our sponsor. Sweet, crisp, fresh, or balanced, whatever the cider you want to make, you will find the right yeast for your favorite cider in the SAF Cider range by Fermentis. This week, let's discover AS2 SAF Cider. AS2 stands for Apple Sweet. Use this cider to bring sweetness and complexity to your cider. It ensures a very good assimilation of fructose and is excellent for low-gravity ciders. The result is a fresh aromatic profile of apple and citrus with nice elaborate fruit notes, kind of like applesauce. SAF Cider AS2 will bring to sweet and dry ciders complex aromatic profiles between fresh and cooked fruits and a rounder mouthfeel. Want to explore diversity of cider profiles? Discover it through the selection of yeast strains by visiting their website, fermentis.com. Up next is our featured presentation pre-recorded at CiderCon 2023 in Chicago. The title of the workshop/tasting is The History, Pomage, and Terroir of New York State's Cider. I am the moderator of this panel, and you'll also hear from Elizabeth Ryan, Gregory Peck, and Ian Merwin. We'll begin with Elizabeth telling us a little bit about herself, then move on to Gregory Peck, and then we'll be hearing from Ian Merwin. So without further ado, let's all grab a glass and join this chat, direct from CiderCon 2023.
I'm Elizabeth Ryan. I live in the Hudson Valley. I own 6 farms. They're all historic. 3 of them are orchards. Stone Ridge Orchard, Breezy Hill Orchard, Drumlin Farm, and Hudson Valley Farmhouse Cider. And I did go to Cornell. I don't think I'm the first woman grad of the pomology department, but it's certainly a small crowd. And I'm honored to be up here with my colleagues, Dr. Gregory Peck and Dr. Ian Merwin, who I consider mentors and 2 of the finest pomologists in the country.
So I teach and I do research at Cornell. I teach classes in pomology and classes in cider production. Co-teach with a colleague who does all the fermentation side. They teach about the apple growing side. So yeah, glad you're all here and looking forward to see what they put together to share today. Ian?
Yeah, I'm Ian Merwin. We're Black Diamond Farm and Cider. Greg was actually one of my last graduate students, so nice to be.
I'm still sweating. I'm waiting for that question. I know there's one more question I'm going to ask you about my dissertation.
Today might be the day.
We've been growing apples on our home farm since 1992 and making cider since 1985. I started making hard cider when I was an impoverished graduate student trying to support my habit. I came to Cornell from California. Out there I made wine. When I came to the Finger Lakes, I decided the thing you really should make if you live here is cider, not wine, because it's really a tradition. And I'm glad to be here. Looking forward to having a good discussion with everybody.
We have 3 different apples that we're featuring, Newtown Pippin, Northern Spy, and the Spitzenberg.
Let's call it Spitz.
Spitz. We're going to be talking about each of those, and we have all New York products in front of us. So I'm going to first hand it over to Elizabeth to tell us a bit about the history of the Hudson Valley.
I think everybody in this room knows that Malus domesticus are not indigenous to North America. But I always like to start that way because it's kind of context for why we had this incredible proliferation of seedling apples in North America. So the Hudson Valley, it was carved out, 13,000 years ago, 14,000 years ago. It was called by the Native American community the river that flows both ways. And what's really distinctive about it is that it originates with the snow melt at Lake Tier of the Clouds in the Adirondacks. It is 315 miles long. And it is where the sea meets the fresh water melts. So it's a very, very, very weathered, old, dynamic region with a salt line that moves up and down the Hudson River. The salt line, there are measurable tides all the way to Albany, which is 5 hours from New York City. And there is a salt line that moves up and down the river. And you may wonder the effect of this, or the incredibly dynamic environment, incredibly narrow, incredibly windy. There are many, many things that originated in the Hudson River, the steamboat, a particular kind of very fast sloop. And so from the earliest days, there was commerce from the Dutch, from Henry Hudson, coming in 1609 and establishing 3 little settlements in the Hudson Valley: Albany, Esopus, Kingston, and Manhattan. And for the first 50 to 75 years, these were the only places that non-native people inhabited in the Hudson River. And you'll understand kind of why that's interesting later. I really love this map because it shows the indigenous communities, and I just want to acknowledge that there were indigenous communities for millennia in the Hudson Valley, Mohican, Wappingers, and other tribes that this land was taken from one way or the other. Henry Hudson sailed up the river in 1609, made contact with communities there. From the beginning, there was conflict. If you ever have a chance to read Robert Jewett's book, he was the navigator, he was the Sephardic navigator for Henry Hudson, and his book has actually been published. And there's very interesting descriptions of the encounters with the indigenous community. Some of them were very good, and some of them were very bad. They actually killed someone who came aboard the boat, and that was the beginning of a great deal of conflict in the Hudson Valley. By the mid-1700s, 10% of the population in Ulster County, which is still where a lot of the fruit industry is based, were enslaved peoples. And I did want to acknowledge the role and the work that those communities have done. So the Newtown Pippin originated as a seedling in a swamp in Newtown, Long Island. Anybody here ever flown through LaGuardia Airport or gone to Shea Stadium? And I'm going to ask Greg, I'm going to turn this over to Greg in a minute. The Prince Nursery, which was one of the first and really one of the most dominant nurseries from 1776, probably a lot of you have seen this. This is the Prince Nursery that was around for 150 years, 4 generations, and was the first commercial nursery. And if you could get up there and look at that, you would see that the first 2 varieties that they listed in their first catalog were Esopus Spitzenberg and Newtown Pippin. Because I discovered today that Greg did research on this nursery and wrote a rather remarkable article. And so I'm going to just throw it to you for a minute to tell us about the Prince family and that nursery and why they were important.
They're often referred to as the first nursery, and so they were in what is Shea Stadium now, Citi Field, right, where the Mets play baseball is. So where the nursery grounds were is now parking lot, but there's a lot of streets in that area still. They're named after plants, and they had all the streets named alphabetically by different plants all the way through there, and that still is a legacy in Queens in that area. You know, at the time it was farmland. It was really nice. It was Long Island, deep soils. It's a glacial till that came down, got scraped off everywhere on the way down. That's how Long Island formed. The glacier was coming back and forth and left that little landmass there. So it's all topsoil, and that nursery provided ornamentals, but also fruit trees to the industries to the west. And they also provided a lot of the material for nurseries as the Europeans and then eventually the Americans moved further west. They sold back in the day. I went through some of their catalogs and some of these large, they had these like one-pagers that they put in the back of newspapers, and they actually had some English cider apples, traditional English cider apples were listed there. So they were growing these things way back when. And certainly cider was being consumed and eventually went out as the 4th generation lost interest in it and as land prices started to get more expensive and urbanization was happening. But a remarkable family and really left a legacy. I'll just one more comment about them is that they were also, they did some breeding, but they did a lot of plum breeding. And so they really looked at plums and especially trying to hybrid some of the American species in with European plums as kind of what the fruit would be the easiest to grow in the area. So,
and we know that that George Washington visited the Prince Nursery with John Adams, and that Jefferson ordered trees a number of times, including the Newtown Pippin. And in 1758, when Ben Franklin was in England, he ordered Newtown Pippins from the Prince Nursery. The English were really, really wowed by these apples. And in this 1770s, they experienced a mini ice age, and the English fruit crop was severely damaged. So this created an unbelievable opportunity that really built significant wealth in New York and wealth in the Hudson Valley. And apples were shipped in barrels. I happen to have a barrel head stencil here. We have a couple of barrel shots. And by the mid-1700s, significant quantities of Newtown Pippins were being shipped to barrels.
We have these two ciders here, one from South Hill and one from Sudstrom Cider. So it's a nice opportunity to taste the two different profiles. One is spontaneous, I believe, on the leaves. That's leaves. And South Hill, I don't believe, is spontaneous from the notes I have.
One thing that's really important to realize about this is that from the first European colonies here until 1754, pretty much everybody was growing seedling apples. I mean, you could not buy a propagated, grafted apple tree. So that's a really long period. And the other thing that makes that so important is that when people came over from Europe on the boat, usually they would have barrels of apples, and they would eat them as they came over, so they didn't get scurvy. And when they got here, as they were eating them, they'd save the seeds. So they went out with these seeds, and the apples that they were bringing over from whatever part of Europe were basically what we call land races. They were the local cultivars that had been domesticated, selected in little valleys and villages throughout Europe. They brought them over. Of course, these are apples that are open pollinated, so the seed in an apple isn't really linked to the parent. It's totally linked genetically, but it's unpredictably linked. So it was this huge experiment of bringing over hundreds or maybe even thousands of known landrace varieties from the old world, taking seeds from them and growing them all up and down the coast of North America. So they took a bunch of very siloed, segregated gene pools, put them all together, and you get this tremendous mixing of the gene pool and a lot of hybrid vigor, and then they started growing them. So that it was a really important selection process in the genetic profile of the modern apple. So it's kind of a secondary enrichment of the gene pool. And these varieties that we're looking at are the result of that. As far as Newtown Pippin grows, and some of you may be a little ambiguous on this, what they call Albemarle Pippin down the Blue Ridge and down south, it's the same apple. We grow a lot of it. When I lived in California in the 1970s, that was always the apple I wanted. When I would go to the supermarket, and you could still buy a lot of them. It was a mainstream apple on the West Coast. Then it got bumped out by Granny Smith. It's the thing that we really love about it as growers. It's quite annual. It's quite productive. The trees are pretty vigorous and robust. We don't make a single variety cider from it. That's a whole different topic, but it's a really good blender. It's been a very important apple in the juice industry on the West Coast as well. Most of you may have had a little Martinelli's cider bottle when you were kids. It had a little cute round apple thing. That's primarily Newtown Pippin with a little bit of Gravenstein and a little bit of Jonagold mixed in. So it's an important apple, really, not just in the East, but throughout the country.
What would you say would be a profile you'd expect from a Newtown Pippin?
It's acid, not super aromatic, moderate sugar content, 13, 14 bricks would be typical. Good keeper, which is really one of the main reasons why they grew it. It's a relatively late harvest, and in general, the later you harvest an apple, the better it's likely to keep. And of course, they didn't have refrigerated storage until the late 1800s. So the keeping quality of the fruit was a really critical factor in whether people wanted to grow it or not.
Any tips on growing them, that particular variety?
Not really. I mean, it's a pretty grower-friendly tree. It's got good distribution of spur fruit versus some tip-bearing fruit. It's an easy apple to grow, which is why it became fairly popular fairly fast. And of course, you got to realize in the era before we had pesticides, probably 5-10% would be about the proportion of your harvest that would be something you could put in a barrel and ship to Europe. And the other 80-90% of the fruit ended up as cider. I mean, that's what you did with any apple. Insect infestation, cosmetics, doesn't matter at all for cider making. What you got to really worry about is certain fungal infections. So.
And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of that industry, in 1845, Robert Pell in Esopus planted 10,000 Newtown Pippins and established this premium trade, and they were getting $21 a barrel in 1845, and those apples were retailing for 42 cents a pound in London. And when I began doing these interviews, there were people who were still, I mean, there's still quite a trade to England, but with that ice age, it was a tremendous financial opportunity for people in the Hudson Valley and beyond. And I've actually read that a number of, I'm pointing at Chuck Shelton, who produced a very fine Newtown Albemarle Pippin, I'll call it Newtown. And Virginia was also beginning to ship a lot of fruit to England in the 1700s. The reason I wanted us to do this session is I did blends for a very, very long time. And it started to get a little muddy to me. I started to feel like I almost didn't know what I was blending or why. I knew I was blending to my palate. And so the last few years, we've been doing a lot of these single varietals. They've caught on. And you could argue that you can make more interesting ciders if you blend, which you can. But I think when you taste these, you really, I mean, personally, I think these two ciders are fantastic.
So we're going to move on to the next. Well, these next two ciders here, we have Northern Spy. That's a misspelling on it. It's not Northern Spry.
That's a good misspelling, though. Yeah.
That would be a new thing.
That might stick.
Autumn at Eve Cider and her team there. And then the Finger Lakes Cider House, a wonderful, beautiful location, full service restaurant and everything. I'm going to go over first to Greg here and just see what you might have to say a little bit about the Northern Spy. Any kind of research going on with that or specific to New York?
Spy was a really important variety for the processing industry for a long time. It was grown all along Lake Ontario. Largely has fallen out of favor now in terms of large-scale production. But there's still orchards that have these apples, and I think from the commercial grower standpoint, they were kind of like, selling them for juice, or maybe some of it would end up in sauce, or a couple other processing outlets, until the cider industry started to pick up, and the cider makers were like, hey, this is, not only does this tell a story, right? You mentioned the story that it tells, but it also has a really nice acid backbone. And so a lot of the cider producers started to seek it out, and it was very affordable to purchase because it was from these really low input orchards that didn't really have another destination that was willing to pay a value. So now Spy has become a bit of a, the growers that still have it, they're able to move that fruit. They get better than what they used to get from the processors. And even, we have some single variety ciders made from it as some examples today, but it's also in a lot of the blended ciders from New York State, even ones that don't even list varieties. Spy is often in there just because it's one that makes its way fairly on the lower end with the right kind of chemical qualities for the cider makers.
Take a taste of this, the Eve Cider, Autumn Stocher's cider maker there, and her husband Ezra. She's one of the most gifted cider makers, I think, in North America. And this is a great example of, it's not easy to make a single variety Northern Spy that has the depth and the complexity of this, but she does it pretty consistently. So shows you what the apple can do in a cider. A couple of things about Northern Spy. It's one of the best apples for making an American-style apple pie. I wouldn't say apple pie because depending on what part of the world you're from, you want something totally different. Like the Brits want Bramleys because the apple's supposed to disintegrate when you cook it. Americans want something that's like, you have to cook it for an hour before it even softens up, and that's Northern Spy. But it's a really great pie apple. It's also, as a tree, it's kind of a pain in the ass to grow, frankly. It's very vigorous, it's biennial, it's a tip bearer, it's a bit of a bear. It became popular early on. It's quite cold hardy, very late harvest, and again, that means it's a good keeper. It's also been important actually if you're growing any apples on any one of the Molly Merton, so MM106, MM111, Northern Spy was one of the parents in that cross. And when the Merton and the Molly stations, so English, Australian apple rootstock breeding programs, were looking for resistance to the woolly apple aphid, they found in the Northern Spy, and so they were able to cross that in, and it really is an important trait of those rootstocks.
And the second cider that we had is blended with Bulmer's Norman. And interestingly enough, when I was putting this talk together, there were not as many people making varietal ciders as I thought. We'll talk a little about that later, but there seemed to be a lot of varietal spies. It's a pain in the neck, it's biennial, it's annoying, it takes years to come into production. So it's scabby. So one of the questions when I started, exactly, I said to Greg and Ian, what is it after a couple hundred years that gives these apples, why do they have, people love spice. What is it about that apple that has given it such staying power? It's really good, people love it.
It's a keeper. You can store it, and it has a lot of acid, and so
it's a beautiful all-purpose.
And it holds up when you bake it.
Yeah, beautiful all-purpose. And it came as a seedling. Seeds came from Connecticut. The apples were planted in East Bloomfield, not in Hudson Valley.
That's Connecticut.
No, East Bloomfield, New York.
New York, okay.
So Rhea has inadvertently touched on an incredible controversy. And the first time we were interviewed in Martha Stewart, and that's one of my favorite apples, I said it was a New York apple, and she got hate mail. She put that in the story from people in Connecticut who claimed it was their apple because the seeds came from Connecticut, which they did. The original tree died. Where did it get the name Northern Spy? Certainly by the 1840s, these were being propagated in huge, quantities by Ellwanger and Berry. The abolition movement was at a fever pitch in New York State, in the Hudson Valley, where we had many Quaker communities, with many Quaker communities up there. I've never established whether there is a real link there. There was a novel that was published. I've read it. It's very florid. But wherever it came from, that name has had so much resonance with people, and I think that's part of it. It's partly the story, the mythology. It's a wonderful.
We've been evaluating a large number of genotypes from the USDA's apple collection in Geneva, New York. And so we just pulled out some data on some of the key juice quality characteristics you might be interested in for the three varieties that we're talking about today. And then at the bottom is just the overall mean, minimum, and maximum for those in the entire data set, just so you can kind of see where they fit amongst everything that we've been looking at. And I guess just some things that come to mind is that, I think one of the things about all three of these and that makes them of interest is that they are balanced between sugar and acid. Other than Spy, the tannins the phenolics are pretty low. But it has a fair amount, from the Long Ashton, the English sort of classification, 4.5 grams per liter is the threshold we get from sweet to a sharp apple. And they use a different analysis, but about 1 And our scale for this method would be about 1.8 would be a bitter apple, grams of gallic acid equivalent per liter. Just to give you some perspective, so they're not like particularly bitter apples, but the acidity and then the sugar balance, and they're kind of in the middle of the pack. And I think that kind of speaks to the ability for them to fit all of these different markets and kind of fit in where over the decades people found a need for an apple that had a good amount of acidity and was available. And that's just some pictures.
Beautiful. They have little stars.
Spies are big. Spies can get quite big and large, and that might also be one of the reasons why they kind of became a well-known variety, right? They're big red apples.
I believe they're triploids. Maybe Ian could tell us about what that means.
Just that you got an extra set of chromosomes, it tends to make them bigger. And a lot of fruits, as humans domesticated them, we selected inadvertently for triploid varieties because of the size factor. And they tend to be a little more environmentally adaptable because you got that extra set of chromosomes, which gives you some potential variability in the genetic response.
A lot of the heritage and heirloom varieties people are growing, a really surprising number of them turn out to be, or maybe it's not surprising, triploids.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the end of the line for them then?
More or less. I mean, they can have seeds, but they just can't donate pollen. So it's partial.
So how do we like these northern spies, these two ciders? Right, you seeing a little bit of the difference between the two? But, it should be mentioned that we have Finger Lake ciders here and then Hudson Valley ciders. So in this case, you're drinking two Finger Lakes region ciders. The terroir is different from those different sites. And if you're not familiar with New York State and the Finger Lakes, it's like actual fingers that go like north to south. They're magnificent. And around the Finger Lakes region, there's just a bevy of cideries, including Ian. And it's a nice destination. These two cideries, Eves and the Finger Lake Cider House and South Hill Cider that you're tasting, all Finger Lakes, and then there's a couple more. So it's a good destination to go to. Is where Gregory Peck is. There's a library to go with some amazing and magnificent collections. So if you can't get up that Ithaca and do that little surrounding trail, you are in for a treat. I'd recommend you at the minimum having like a nice long weekend to do that. And then the other ciders we have here are from the Hudson Valley. And so we're going to go to the Esopus Spitzenberg from Hudson Valley Farmhouse Cider, which is our own dear Elizabeth Bryan.
And Rhea asked me the right way to say the name. And in the Hudson Valley, nobody knows. So there's every variation of pronunciation in common daily usage. Esopus is a tiny, tiny little town. And again, I encourage you to look at some of these maps. It's about halfway up the river, and it was one of the three towns that the Dutch settled very, very early. I brought with me one of the local history, books. There's almost no mention in there of the Esopus Spitzenberg or the Newtown Pippin, even though these apples built great wealth in these communities. It fascinates me that we have a history book, but that wasn't important to people. When I came into the valley, very few people were growing these apples. Very few people are still growing these apples. And one of the important things that's going on with the cider revival is it's reviving these historic varieties. And last night at the tasting, we were pouring wonderful ciders from Metal House. They are right in the heart of Esopus. And Esopus still probably doesn't have a population of I don't think there's 2,000 people in this long, skinny town. We don't really know the origin. It's another seedling apple, but we know that it was important enough to be propagated for a couple hundred years and sent to Virginia and planted at Monticello, and one of Thomas Jefferson's favorite apples. Again, a premium trade was established in the Hudson Valley. In the 1920s, people were still shipping massive quantities of barreled ciders to European houses, apple houses that specialized. I've seen mastheads that say specializing in American apples. And a lot of those apples were Spitz, they were Pippins, they were Ben Davis. A lot of Ben Davis went, a lot of Ben Davis grown in the Hudson Valley. There are virtually no Ben Davis grown in the Hudson Valley anymore that I'm aware of. Spitz, it's a beautiful, and I've talked to people, again, how many people grow Spitz here? Oh, yay. And how many people are doing cider from them? Not too many. So I was really shocked that I couldn't find another varietal when we were putting this together. Some people were doing blends. We've blended with Spitz for years. The first time we pressed them, I was shocked because the juice was so light and delicate and pear-like. I mean, we Downing called them pear-like. And they have these kind of melon notes. And we never had enough. They always went into a blend for me. And then a couple of years ago, we finally had enough. And I thought, I'm just going to bottle this. And I don't even think it's that interesting. I mean, just being frank to me. I felt it was too thin. And I like a more bodied, tannic cider. And to the point that this gentleman made earlier, in our community, people drive through Esopus. If you drive up and down the river and you drive to Kingston, you drive through Esopus, not much of a town, but people know that name and it means something to them. And when we started telling the story of that apple, we can't keep up with the demand for the cider. And in fact, this is probably my last case of last year's Spitz. So it's had a wonderful, it's been really interesting and curious and exciting that people have such an emotional, connection in our area.
Were you able to
that
make it
apple.
again? Were you able to make it again this year?
Yeah, it's not finished yet. It's another one of these apples that's pretty obscure, that's being revived, that we need to continue. And these are really our apples. So we grow a lot of different things, and it's great to try to grow Gabinet and wonderful stuff with tannins. But as we're really trying to bring back these old traditional cider apples, dual-purpose apples in the Hudson Valley, it's kind of cool. It's exciting to me. So
lovely. I know one other single varietal that is made down at Bluebeat Cider. I had it last year, but others.
We make our rosé is about 92% Spitz, and the rest is actually a plum wine that we make from Medley. A couple things about the variety. It's like a local, not widely grown apple, but actually its genes are all over the world because it was the parent of Jonathan, which is a really, in my opinion, underrated cider apple. And Jonathans are grown all over Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And then Jonathan was one of the parents of Jonagold, which is another very aromatic, really wonderful dessert apple. We actually put a little bit of it in our pomelo most years.
Jonathan originated in Ulster County. It's another seedling apple that originated in Ulster County.
And the tree is kind of really interesting. They look terrible. The leaves are kind of gray and a little twisted. If you've ever grown Jonagold, those leaves will twist as well. And it's one of those apple trees that you look at it, and it's a fairly consistent cropper. It's one of a group of what I would call dual-purpose apple varieties. Wonderful to have an apple that people will pay $3 a pound for in the local market. And the culls or whatever part of it you don't sell can make a good cider. So I really encourage cider makers to look. There's a lot of Ashmead's kernels and other golden russet. There's a lot of apples that you can sell them this way or you can sell them that way. And it gives you a huge advantage. The downside of that, in my case, at least, I used to have to fight my wife all the time because she wanted to take them to market, and you can sell them as fast as you take them to market. And I wanted them for cider, and we were back. And she usually won that argument. But it's economically, the dual-purpose heirloom cider fresh varieties are really a good bet.
Alrighty, so I'm going to go out to this young woman.
Okay. If it makes you feel better, my husband and I have the same argument about market versus cider. He always wants the cider, I always want to take them to market, so you're not alone. Do you happen to know how did we get so many Jonathan apple trees here?
I have no idea why. Maybe you know, Elizabeth.
Well, I think.
Why are there so many Jonathan apples here?
First of all, I think it's reliable, quote unquote. It's a reliable apple, and my mother always, who was from Iowa, revered Jonathan's, and her grandfather, the first orchard he planted Northern Spies, Jonathan's, and Whitney's. Believe it or not, he left Whitney's, and a lot of these trees came out from New York State. They came in wagons, they came on trains, they came out of Ellwanger and Berry and other nurseries. By the 19th century, we had many, many small nurseries, and actually asked John Bunker once why people was curious. Certainly people were planting seedling varieties, and certainly people could get cyanwood, and they were getting cyanwood, but tremendous numbers of grown trees were coming from New York State to Iowa, to Idaho, to Wyoming, to California. And I don't know, I think it's just that, you knew what you were getting, and you could get a tree in the ground and not have to wait. That's what I think. The question of Jonathan has fascinated me for a long time because it's from Ulster County. It's literally disseminated all over the world. They grow huge numbers of Jonathans in Eastern Europe, and it's an incredible parent. The genetics of Jonathan are in so many, not just Jonagold and Jonomac, and these Jonathan crosses. As a grower, I have a few of them. I have Monroe, Melrose, these old kind of processing. I think they have a really robust flavor, and I think that they are also another underrated potential cider apple, Jonathan. We don't talk enough about.
Okay, I saw one hand on this side, and then we'll go to you in the back next.
The history of these apples, around Prohibition, there was a lot of winter, freezes and things. Can you guys talk a little bit more about how the heirloom apples kind of declined in popularity around temperance and Prohibition? I vaguely know a little bit about it, but if you have any information historically.
Why these apples declined during Prohibition?
Well, there was a confluence of weather-related climate things, and then there was also the source of Prohibition.
I think the main factor was supermarkets.
Yeah.
A handful of, corporations telling growers what they could grow and what it had to look like, and it had to be either all yellow or all green or all red, and then that just profoundly altered the global market. We went from diverse local cultivars to an industry that is really dominated by a small group of corporations with fairly narrowly defined ideas about what people would buy. And actually the thing that sort of broke that down a bit was honeycrisp. That was because the supermarkets at first didn't want any part of it because it wasn't yellow. It was kind of a muddy red, and but that opened up the gates to where now, if you in the supermarket shelves, there's dozens of varieties. But it took 50, 60, 80 years for that to happen.
So it wasn't like the Baldwin where the hurricane of 39 dropped a whole bunch of. That's I think what you're talking about, Shannon. Dropped in New England an immense amount of Baldwin apple trees like that.
It was the winter of 34, 35 that killed one of them too.
Yeah, I actually interviewed a grower who survived that winter. Vince Filsinger was one of my first oral histories. He's actually a Canadian grower, and he told me that it was a test winter, and that you could go outside, and he said he went outside and he thought he was hearing shotguns because he could just hear these old Baldwin and these old 100-year-old orchards just cracking, just splitting in half. And a lot of those orchards were never replanted, and when they weren't replanted to those cultivars. By then, people were replanting in the Hudson Valley the new Cortland apple, the new Red Delicious, and the new, they weren't brand new, but they were planting Red Delicious, they were planting Goldens, they were planting Cortlands, and so they didn't replant these old cultivars. And that's just a historical situation.
Does you have a question in the back?
Yeah, two-part question. I'm curious, as growers and makers, how you would quickly characterize
the distinctive qualities of the two distinct terroirs? Hudson Valley, Finger Lakes, what are the environmental factors that contribute to that? Just quick blurs. And also, as you're pourer, we've got another bottle of cider back here. Do you want us to pour it for the room?
There's a bonus cider?
There's a bonus cider. There's a bonus cider.
Sure, pour it.
This is a cider that Leif sent, and this is another Northern Spy.
The two different terroirs of the Finger Lakes and the Hudson Valley.
We'll be here a while. Thank you.
People probably won't like my answer. A couple of years ago, we did what I call a spy down in Ithaca. We did a really fun tasting of a couple of different spies. One of the things that I noticed, and I'll talk about Autumn in particular, because we know them very well, is they really let this fruit hang. They really let it mature. And a lot of the people that are growing these apples for processing are under a lot of, they're under pressure to get it picked and, get it off to wherever it's going. And I think that the way people grow is as important as terroir. And I'm not sure we really know yet, because I think a lot of this fruit, and we buy a lot of northern spice, and most of the spice we get are grass green and starchy. And it's because people are afraid, I think, to let them hang. So there's just a whole lot more, and I don't think we're going to know about terroir until we can get people to let them hang long enough to really get that flavor to come up.
Having said that, the soils are really different. In the Finger Lakes, for the most part, we have these beautiful glacial fill soils. The pH is almost neutral as opposed to Hudson Valley, where typically the soils are acid. Their organic matter is higher in the Finger Lakes. Really different soil. And the Hudson Valley is consistently hotter. But bloom in the Hudson Valley is usually a week to 10 days ahead of bloom in the Finger Lakes.
Which makes it very, very risky to be a grower in the Hudson Valley.
I'm going to step in here for a second, just talk about the cider that was poured. This is the same maker from your cider number 2, Leaf Silverstone. And this is a Northern Spy. It's, again, a native yeast. I believe all the rest of them are non-native yeast, unless I didn't get shown up for that. But, so again, a native yeast, just a... the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
But this is just a beautiful, beautiful cider, and another beautiful rendition of the Northern Spice maker. So the other second part of that question was a little bit about climate change, and I think that might be kind of interesting to touch upon our current situation, with what you're seeing there for growing. Or maybe like Gregory might have a couple thoughts about that.
Sure. I mean, boy, it's there's nobody unaffected, especially if you're farmer, if you're growing fruit. For apple growing, of course, spring frosts are probably the most biggest concern in New York, many other parts of the world too. We don't have an issue with chill units. We get plenty of degree hours or chill units between 32 and 45 Fahrenheit. But I think the hardest thing probably is the irregularity of our summers. We're going from, feels like almost every other year now, between drought and flood conditions.
Feast or famine.
And so from the growers' perspective, especially for the large-scale commercial growers, they're investing in both more drain tiles and more irrigation. They're investing in more wind machines. They're investing in more fabrics to go over orchards. And so the orchards are becoming more intensive in a lot of ways. They're requiring more inputs to deal with climate change. We haven't seen a big shift in varieties for the most part. There's a few exceptions though, like things that we used to not be able to ripen in New York, like Pink Lady, for example. We're starting to see some growers put in Pink Lady. It's a very late harvest, like end of October, almost beginning of November for Pink Lady. And so now we have some growers who are able to grow that, where 10 years ago they were told, don't even try, you never ripen it here. So it's dramatic, it's and unpredictable in the fact that we don't know what to expect, but we can predict that we can expect change. In terms of the fruit or cider making perspective, besides for the loss and the expense of growing fruit, which is going to become more for both counts, I think it's also hotter temperatures tend to make for lower acid fruit, and so that could affect just as we watch the cider industry evolve, like what kinds of ciders. New York, the Finger Lakes in particular, is really known for its high acid ciders. Just kind of a style that's developed because of fruit availability, and then kind of like I think there's a little bit of a local thing where they're all looking at each other and they're making a lot of high acid ciders, and that may become harder to make as the summers get hotter and hotter.
I think that the site selection is incredibly important. That's always been important to fruit growers, and I think everybody here knows the importance of aspect and being near a body of water in the Finger Lakes. They, have incredible climates there, but you're very, very far away from markets. In the Hudson Valley, if you're within a mile or 2 miles of the river, and if you see these old roads, and again, you look at these maps, the reason we have 3 orchards is so that we can mitigate some of the risk. We have never lost a crop in the Milton orchard, which we can see the river. Last year, our apricots bloomed on February 10th. If you're in the Hudson Valley, you can imagine how panicked we were when we looked out the window and saw the apricots in bloom, and yet we got a crop. I said to my partner, Ted, there's no way in hell we're going to get apricots. And yet, remarkably, and that is that moderating effect and air drainage. And when I was looking for a farm, and the closer you are to the river, the more expensive they get, because we've been impacted by development pressures for 300 years. You have the view sheds. And if you were to get in a boat and go up and down the Hudson River, and I will say we were the epicenter of table grape production in the 19th century, and you'll see all these beautiful old, if you go in the winter, you'll see all of these old terraced, there was a slide that you had up that was loading the night boat. In Milton, they say 50 boats a night would go out of Milton, the tiny little town of Milton that I live in. And so when I was looking for a farm, somebody, I think at the Hudson Valley Lab, told me you want to be as close to the river as you can get. And if you have to go over that first ridge, they call it Ridge Row, and you'll lose 10 degrees. This was, I think our fruit agent, Warren Smith, told me this. And if you go over that next ridge, you'll lose 10 more degrees. And if you go over the gunks, the Shawang gunks, forget it. You'll never be a commercial grower. And if any of you have been to Angry Orchard, if you're in their tasting room and you look out, there's this beautiful ridge that actually runs all the way down to our Stone Ridge Orchard. We are 20 miles away, but we can look at the same ridge. But the impact of climate and air drainage is also a very critical factor. And we get, when we lose crops in the Hudson Valley, it's spring frosts that are devastating. And now we're getting very hot summers and very hot falls. And so our challenge is on the other end, that we're getting a lot of premature ripening. And so some of us talk about moving to New England or Maine or Vermont, because I think you see that going on the West Coast, but it's we are getting these 100-degree days routinely in August and September, and we have a lot of trouble holding fruit on the trees.
I mean, give it up for these guys.
Wowza, what a treat for me to be able to just be up front with that amazing panel of Elizabeth Ryan, Dr. Gregory Peck, and Dr. Ian Merwin. Remember that Ian has Black Diamond Cider up in the Finger Lakes, and Elizabeth Ryan is Hudson Valley Farmhouse Cider. And they all do so much more. There is a paper that Gregory Peck has sent to me, is a PDF more on the Prince Nursery that was in the Queens area, by or in Long Island, I should say. So I'll be putting that up in the show notes for this here episode 358. And there were slides that Elizabeth was referring to. Those will also be at the show notes at ciderchat.com. If you hung out this long and got value from this here podcast, please do consider becoming a patron today. Google Cider Chat Patreon is spelled Patreon, or hit the donate button at ciderchat.com. And with that, I leave you here. This is Rhea Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
We like cider. We like palms. We love orchards and having fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider. We like palms. We like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Oh yes, we do. We like palms. Oh yes, we do. We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we do it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Ba-da-da-dum. Ba-da-da-dum. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Ba-da-da-dum. We like palms. Oh yes, we do. We like orchards, having some fun.
Yeehaw!